Know my height and my welcome. We are here today to talk about how the disability system works. And the goal of it is to give you enough of a picture to explain how kind of things flow through, what the different main parts of this puzzle are. Because in my 20 years of working with disabled people and trying to make this system work, I have found so many people don't understand all of the components and therefore don't understand why things get stuck where they do or why policies and rules change the way they do. So the hope is that we are giving you enough information to understand a little bit of that context. So it's a three-part workshop series. Today we're talking about how the system works. Next week we're talking about needs assessments and that process. And then on the third week we are talking about individualized funding and how that works. So across all those three things, as I talk tonight, I'll probably refer to, we'll do more of that next time. So today, what we are hoping to cover is kind of that big structure of the system. We're going to talk about eligibility for the disability system. We're going to talk about NASCs and what they do. We talk about some of the common outcomes of the needs assessment process, a little bit on some of the changes that have happened this year, and a little bit about where else you can go to get some more information. So it's a bit of a whirlwind tour to cover in half an hour, but hopefully enough to give you some good content to fill in the gaps. So we start with a picture of how the system all works. And if you're on a phone, it's like teeny tiny, and I apologize. But at the top of that picture is the New Zealand government. So we pay our taxes, they all go into this giant funnel of money, and the government splits that money across a whole lot of different ministries, a whole lot of different services. And in that disability space, it might be ACC, it might be the Ministry of Education. Lots of services still sit within Te Whatu Ora, within Health New Zealand. Um, Lots of some of that stuff happens within Oranga Tamariki. And there was, of course, the creation of Whaikaha, which is the Ministry of Disabled People. Today, we're primarily talking about the Ministry of Social Development, MSD. And so MSD do lots of things. They run all the work and income offices. They have a whole lot of job seeking programs and all sorts of different work that they do. In fact, Oranga Tamariki technically sits within the Ministry of Social Development. But primarily when it comes to disability, we're talking about two different parts of MSD. One is the piece that manages day services and community participation. And that's separate because it's lived within the Ministry of Social Development for a really long time. And the other piece is what they've started publicly talking about as Disability Support Services, or DSS. And so DSS services are most of what we think of when we think of disability services, the services that a NASC will send you off to. And the reason that they're separate and they've got this little brand of DSS is because in before 2022, DSS used to sit within the Ministry of Health, and then it moved to Whaikaha, the Ministry of Disabled People, and now it's moved to the Ministry of Social Development. So DSS has jumped around, but actually it stayed as quite a entity of its own, right? Lots of the management has stayed the same, lots of the systems and structures have stayed the same. It's just jumped around the ministry. So DSS is mainly what we're talking about today. So DSS run contract the needs assessment services. So usually a needs assessment service, the NASC, is an organisation in its own right, and there's one in each region. In Mid-Central, they took away the NASC and they built a new thing, which they called Mana Whaikaha. So that's a slightly different way of going about that work in Palmerston North in the Mid-Central area. And then if you're in Christchurch or in Waikato, there's a different system again. So you can either use the needs assessment system or you can use the Enabling Good Lives system. Not quite as simple as getting a choice. There's criteria to go into those. But we're talking about that kind of suite of what a NASC is, how they work, and what they can do in the space of receiving services. So that's kind of my picture of how it flows down, because you have to kind of consider that disability sits across everything, right? It's not one little unique part of your life that doesn't integrate with everything else. It sits in how we engage in school, how we engage in healthcare, how we engage in, using the supermarkets. It's part of everyday life. But when it comes to the government, most of what the government is trying to provide as support to disabled people comes through that Ministry of Social Development, through DSS, Disability Support Services, through the NASC, and then usually through a contracted organisation who's there to help you receive that service. So it's going through quite a little maze of things before it becomes a service that you get to receive. So, as I said, in 2022, they set up the Ministry of Disabled People, Whaikaha, and they moved all of that support out of the Ministry of Health and put it into this brand new ministry. And they said, this is it. It's one of the first Ministry of Disabled People in the world. It's going to be fantastic. And then in March 2024, pretty much overnight, they changed all the rules to how people could access their flexible supports, like individualised funding. And they announced that Whaikaha was not a financially viable way of doing this, and that things needed to change. So September 2024, they took this department of DSS out of Whaikaha and moved it into the Ministry of Social Development. But it stayed, as I say, as its own little entity. So Whaikaha no longer manages direct services to disabled people. They now are in charge of, well, they always were, helping the whole government be more responsive and better support disabled people, but they no longer have a budget and services in which they can do that. It's more about policy and promoting the right things. And they set up a task force to try and make disability support services more financially viable and more fair and equitable, I think might have been their words. And that task force is still going. So they made some changes in 2024. They made some more changes this year where they brought flexibility back to individualised funding and flexible budgets. And they also made some changes to needs assessments that we'll touch on a little bit later and we'll talk a lot more about next week. So it's quite a changeable system. There has been a lot that has moved, a lot that has shuffled. A number of pieces within the system have rebranded as we've gone. So it's not particularly surprising that lots of disabled people, lots of people trying to use this system don't understand what's going on. It's like a full-time job to understand all of these changes and all of this complexity. So it's quite confusing. So as I said, it's the Ministry of Social Development holds the money from the government. DSS, which is part of the Ministry of Social Development, is responsible for ensuring that disabled people receive their disability supports. They contract needs assessors, the NASC system, to work out which supports each individual gets, and DSS contract disabilities organisations, disability support organisations, to deliver services to those disabled people. And the NASC refer you to those organisations that have got a contract with DSS. And the NASC can't really refer you outside of that system. They really only refer you to the ones that DSS have already picked. So it's quite a closed kind of system that's not necessarily based on what you would like the most, but instead a giant system that has lots of rules that you need to work out. What of the things we have available can we offer in this situation? So for that to all make sense, you have to be able to get into the system. So then the question comes about who is eligible for disability support services. The eligibility criteria says that disability support services are available to people who have a physical, intellectual, or sensory disability, or who have autism, or they have a combination of that. Lots of people have more than one of those things. It has to be something that's going to continue for more than 6 months, and it needs to have ongoing support. That you need ongoing support to live independently. So you have to have a need that needs to be met to be able to use the system as well. That NASC process is primarily for people under 65, There are exceptions where people kind of age and stay within the system for a while, but it's designed for people to come in when they're younger. And there's a different system for aged care support. And you have to be eligible for public services in New Zealand. Um, so there's kind of, some quite clear criteria about what gets you entry. Weirdly, in the criteria that I was double checking today, it doesn't specifically say that it can't have been caused by an accident, but clearly things go through the ACC system if they were accident related, and so they don't fit within this NASC system. It needs to be something no other government department should fund. It becomes quite a tricky thing, right? Of being able to justify that you meet one of these criteria. For some people, it's really open and closed. And for other people, it's a lot more trying to justify why something that's happening in their lives meets this criteria. So when I kind of dig into that a little bit more, it is about it's important to note that an autism diagnosis does give you automatic eligibility for a needs assessment. They did start picking holes recently in people who had telehealth diagnoses where they hadn't met in person with a professional who diagnosed them. So other than that, which is still debated, and if that's how you got your diagnosis, you just need to keep having that fight, I think. But other than that, an autism diagnosis is automatic entry into getting a needs assessment. But some other things that we would think give you automatic entry don't. So FASD, fetal alcohol, ADHD, dyslexia, Tourette's, some of those things where we know that people often have quite significant need for support, doesn't necessarily give you entry into the system unless you also have a physical, sensory, or intellectual disability. So if you have FASD and an intellectual disability, then you have eligibility into the system. But if you only have one of those, it isn't justification for you to come into the system. The other really tricky part is just because you are eligible to have a needs assessment doesn't mean you're eligible for any support. So while we say that everybody with an autism diagnosis can have a needs assessment, sometimes those needs assessments come out and say you don't get any help at this point. So that's the other assumption, I guess, that lives out there, is that people go, well, I've got my autism diagnosis now. I'll go to the NASC and I'll get some help. And sometimes you go to the NASC and the NASC say, no, come back later when you actually have a need that we decide is relevant. So it's just a really tricky little piece in there of kind of, yeah, knowing that that doesn't always mean that people receive services. And then there's the other complexity of the NASC system is only responsible for the disability part of your life. And that comes with this beautiful assumption, right? That we're all neat little boxes and we can go, this part of my life is mental health, and this part of my life is disability, and this part of my life is health. And most often those things completely intersect and overlap. But in a needs assessment, their job is to pick out and go, this piece is related to your disability, and those pieces are nothing to do with disability. And so we're not, even though you have a need, that need is health related or that need is mental health related, and therefore not in this scope of the needs assessment. So being able to talk about your disability related need and kind of make sure that when you're talking about it, when a needs assessment, that you do really emphasize the disability elements is really important. And the other thing that I really like to warn people about is over time they've become really strict on ensuring that people have an intellectual disability diagnosis where it's relevant. What has historically happened is that kids get diagnosed with a thing called GDD, which is kind of a developmental delay, a global developmental delay. And what's supposed to happen is as they get older and things become more settled, the professionals are supposed to decide if somebody actually has an intellectual disability, or if just as a kid they were struggling with some things and it wasn't an intellectual disability, it was other factors. But what's often happened, particularly in that public system, is that people have never been tested for an intellectual disability. So their global developmental delay diagnosis expires when you become an adult. It's not a thing that exists in adulthood, according to the professionals. And so there have been quite a large number of people who have then hit 18 and the NASC system has said you are no longer diagnosed with a disability. You no longer have a piece of paper that says you have a disability, and so we can no longer deliver you services. And so people have had to pay to go to private professionals to get an intellectual disability diagnosis. So it's just really important to know that if that's a situation that you're in, before you leave pediatrician services, before you stop engaging with whoever gave you that diagnosis, that you get them to write you a piece of paper that very clearly says you have an intellectual disability, if that's relevant, because otherwise you end up paying thousands of dollars in an urgent situation where suddenly the NASC have said, if you can't deliver this piece of paper by the end of the month, we'll cut off all your services. So it's good to know proactively because it sucks when it happens at the last minute. Okay, so we've talked about getting into the system. You're eligible for the system, or you're, having that conversation with the NASC. Then you tend to move to a different part of the NASC and you talk about you have a needs assessment. So as I said, in mid-central Waikato and Christchurch, that might be through Enabling Good Lives rather than through something that is called a NASC. But to be honest, the process is pretty similar. Their behind the scenes magic is slightly different, but their function is the same. The DSS has given each region a budget. They've been given a pool of money and said, this is the pool of money you have to support disabled people in that area. And it used to be quite a flexible pool of money, and now it is really strict. Each region has to keep their budget no matter what, which is why we've had over the last few years cuts and people having holds on things because they suddenly got told that they could not spend a dollar more than their allocated budget. What that also has meant is it's made the NASC be a little more forthright about the fact that their budgets aren't very well calculated. They're not based on the change in population. They're not based on the number of referrals that they get. They're based on this is how much money you spent last year. We'll maybe give you about the same or a tiny bit more. Or this is what your budget was last year, and so we'll give you about the same or a tiny bit more. So it doesn't, if they suddenly get, a huge number of referrals, they don't have any more money to share out. They don't get any more staff, and they don't get any more money to service the people in that region. So it's a really flawed system from that perspective. That's not our problem, but it does help kind of explain the picture that we've got. And there's no way around a NASC. You can't go to a different part of the system. You can't pick a different NASC. Each region only has one, except for the Christchurch Waikato place with EGL. So you have to engage with the one that you've got. And they're all slightly different. So like 20 years ago, they handed out a contract. They said each region can have one NASC. Who's it going to be? And in some regions, it's part of the DHB. In some regions, it's a small charity. There's Aotearoa, which is now the NASC for, I think, 6 different regions. So they're all operating really differently from a, kind of fancy high level, but from the services you receive, the work they've done this year is to try and make that more consistent. So you should get that big full needs assessment process about every 4 years. At the moment, they're running a bit behind, so it's probably closer to 5. But it, kind of that's what the practice is that actually in between that, they're not supposed to talk to you very much. They're supposed to just roll over that funding or tweak it and keep things pretty much as they are. And so while there have been lots of changes behind the scenes, from a user perspective, actually fundamentally things haven't shifted very much. Hopefully it makes things more consistent and user friendly. Their job has changed a lot, but our experience hasn't really. But the thing I wanted to talk about is what kind of outcomes people usually get from a needs assessment. Because what I find is lots of people don't know. They don't know where they're sitting, what's normal, what's what the kind of common outcomes are. So when we're thinking about kids, younger people, people who are living in the family home, the default setting for a needs assessment, if they decide you need a little bit of help, is that kids get carer support. And so often, if somebody goes to a needs assessment for the first time and the system comes out and says, here you go, here's 20 carer support days, enjoy. And they would like to then not talk to you for another 4 years. And a carer support day is it's just a contribution towards the support that you need. So it's just gone up. It's $85 a day now, which is still nowhere near minimum wage or, enough money to pay petrol from driving from the other side of town, really. So that's kind of the default setting. There are a couple of ways that you can get home support and community support, home support and home and community support, where an organisation will send a staff member to you. So home support being like a kind of buddy support service where they send like a nice person to engage with the young person while their parents have some respite. And home and community support is focused around helping with showering or dressing or kind of much more practical home tasks. Um, so those are kind of their, you might get a few hours a week of that, unless you've got some quite kind of like complex support situations. And then with kids, individualized funding is one of the rarer options that actually they think you need to have reasonably high needs to get individualized funding. And they say that because, I guess it depends as you're getting older. At the 4, 5, 6-year-old space, they're imagining that parents are doing most of this work. And so, unless there's quite complicated support needs, they're assuming that their parents will do all of the cooking, all of the cleaning, help them put on their shoes, do all those things anyway. But by the time we get to 16, 17, then it is moving towards that much more likely to have individualized funding because actually, if you are still needing help with those practical daily tasks, then the assumption is that you will, that actually that's not what most peers are doing at that point. So individualized funding is more common as you hit those teenage years, and it's more common if there's a reason that they're acknowledging you need significant respite. But lots of people kind of going through the 10 and 12 and 14 will end up with a little bit of carer support and not a lot else. So that's quite common. And then out of home respite is kind of the biggest thing they have available to us, which is where you go and stay in a different home for a night, for a period of time, and in that situation, there's support, there's 24/7 staffing to be with you. So that's, I guess, the biggest support that they tend to have available to kids. And again, then still you often only get 2 nights a month or something like that. It's still quite a small amount of support. So there's also extra things. There's things like equipment services for wheelchairs or for making homes more accessible. There's behaviour support services. There are some day services, and each region has some interesting, unique options where there is enhanced individualised funding, or there are holiday programs that are funded. And there's always also exceptions. Like I know people who have got 10 carer support days, and I know people who've got more than 100 carer support days. I know people with individualised funding budgets that are really small and ones that are really ginormous. So it's not kind of a hard and fast rule, but it just does give you a little picture of what the common outcomes of this needs assessment process are. So then if we flip that over and we think about in the adult space, the same thing, carer support sits at the bottom. That's the easiest, lowest level option that they have available to you. Individualized funding in an adult space is actually a reasonably low level of support. as I said, some people have $200,000 individualized funding budgets, so that's at the other end of the scale. But most often people are getting, kind of reasonably, who just need a little bit of help to maintain their independence. Those people often end up with individualized funding. Um, Home and community support and supported independent living are two services that are kind of there where, again, an agency will send you a staff member, and they will come alongside you with home and community support to do the practical tasks that you need, the showering, the dressing, the laundry, and with supported independent living to teach you to do those things yourself. So the core difference between home and community support and supported living is that supported living is helping you be able to do it by yourself, and home and community support is doing it for you. Um, and again, some people have huge home and community living supports because they need help with each of those physical tasks throughout the day. And some people get 4 hours a week to help them in the shower. So it's really variable. Out of home respite exists in the adult space. I should have said with the youth ones. They're almost always very full, and they really suit some families fantastically, and they really don't suit others. So, kind of if that's something you're considering, it's really worth getting on a wait list as early as you can because often it takes you a really long time to get into that service. But knowing that is there if it suits the way that you do life. Then you get to residential care and choice and community living. Choice and community living isn't available across the country. It's only in Auckland, Waikato, Hutt Valley, Southland, and Otago. Um, but both of those are designed for people who need kind of 24/7 support, need people with them most of the time, have quite high levels of support. And in residential care, that's the only service where the organisation has a home and you go and live in their place. So all the others, you live fundamentally in your own home, wherever your home is, be that with parents, be that flatting, be that in a caravan on a farm in the middle of nowhere. But in residential care, it's the other way around. An organisation has a place, and you go to them to live, and to receive your 24/7 support. Those ones too tend to have really big wait lists, so it's really worth having that conversation early on if that's a thing that you are moving towards. Um, but it is, I guess it's just kind of, wanting to show you that continuum, right? So that if you've currently only got 10 days of care support, but you think you're on a pathway to residential, that gap is really big. And when you go to the needs assessors and you go, I'd like to go all the way to the top of the pile now, please, they kind of go, well, hang on, no, 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 we'll do something in between. So it's just worth kind of, realizing that there is this whole spectrum. And there are so many other services out there. This is only kind of the main ones, the ones that happen in most of the regions. But there's probably 100 different contracts across the whole country that do bits and pieces. But this is kind of trying to give you a bit of a picture of what that intensity looks like. So I also just want to acknowledge day services because they don't fit within this needs assessment process. To access the day service funding, it goes through, you have to get it through a transition provider or through an organisation that has that contract for delivering day services. So if in your last year of high school you have high OARS funding, then when you leave school, you're eligible to try and find a service who offers community participation, but it's not a guarantee. It's not a service that you can always access. But if you have very high OARS funding when you are in your last year of school, then you are eligible for very high needs funding after school. And that can be attending like a traditional day service. And it can be like a budget these days where you can access it through some of the individualized funding hosts, and you can use that to be able to connect with the community in the way that's right for you. So that is an important piece of the day service of the how do you fill your week puzzle. But it's quite strongly influenced by what you're funded for in your last year of school. And the needs assessors say that's not us got nothing to do with us. We don't know anything about that. Sorry. So it's just good for you to have that information. Except in Northland, where the transition provider is the NASC, but that's a whole nother story. Okay, so in 2026, there's been more changes. As I said earlier, the flexibility came back to individualized funding and personal budgets and flexible disability supports. There used to be we kind of got taken out many of those things that we were allowed to purchase and extra things we were allowed to do. Now that flexibility is back, and there hasn't been any talk yet of that changing. And now the focus is on the purpose of your funding. So when you go through your needs assessment process, we'll talk about it more next week, you write a goal plan, a My DSS plan, in the long term, once we've all gone through our 5-year cycle of getting needs assessments. You set a purpose, you set what you're trying to achieve with your supports. And then so long as what you are doing aligns to those purposes, you've got quite big flexibility about how you're going to go about making that happen. So definitely if you're in a process of writing some goals with the NASC, leave them really nice and broad. No, I will go to gymnastics on Tuesdays at 4, and lots of I will engage more with my community, because then everything fits in those nice big categories. And anyway, at their level, they're putting them all into really high level categories. So behind the scenes, they've changed all sorts of stuff. There's a new calculation tool, and they're still consulting about disability support services. So there's currently still a survey out with DSS. If you like to fill in surveys and tell the government what you think, you can still fill in that survey. It's much more about how we would like them to engage with us. It's a lot about how they might be able to understand transitions in our lives and kind of proactively engaging with people. But yeah, it's not certainly very focused on what cool things could we create that would make disabled people's lives better, which is the questions we would all love to see in a survey like that. And then reassessments were paused through all of these changes and this updating of the needs assessment process. They have told us that needs assessments are all back up and running and that new people can enter the system, and that kind of they've started with their standard assessment process again. But I've also just recently heard that in Waikato they might be pausing them again for reasons unknown. So yeah, expect that the system is working again and that you should be getting needs assessments and reviews as you were. But the biggest thing with them at the moment is knowing that they are dropping balls because they've been doing all sorts of things behind the scenes. And so if you are waiting on an ask and you've been waiting for a month or so, call them and chase them and annoy them to know that they haven't just misplaced you in their queue, because that has been a reasonably common occurrence in the last few months. Okay, nearly done. I wanted to just talk a little bit about the disability information services. So if you don't know, across the country there are a whole lot of different disability information services. So almost every region has one specific for that location, whose job it is literally to help disabled people navigate the system, to help you get access to the information that you need, to answer your questions, to run events for you. Some of them have amazing mailing lists that they'll send you out what's happening in the community. Some of them have really great workshops that are really worth knowing about. So if you don't know who the disability information services are in your community, then I really encourage you to go and find them. And then there are also ones that are focused on specific parts of the disability community. So complex care group primarily work with people in that high and complex space. That is what they do, that is what they know. So if you're in that space and you've never engaged with complex care, it's really good to find your community in this space. Whakatautua work with Pacifica whānau across the country, I'm pretty sure. And so they do some wonderful work about ensuring that Pacifica people are engaging with the NASC system and actually getting the supports that they need. There's places like Autism New Zealand, Cerebral Palsy Society, Down Syndrome Association, that all kind of are there to ensure that the different pieces of the puzzle are actually, kind of clear and that you are able to access the information that you need. And you're allowed to just call them and ask them questions. If you're like, I don't get how this works, could you explain it to me? That's part of what they do, is they help you understand it. So use them. I also really like Altogether Autism because they'll go off and research something for you. So if you've got like a weird question of like, I wonder if there's a correlation between this thing and this thing, they've got researchers on staff who will go off and find out whether there's any information to add to that story. Um, so it's quite cool to know that you can go to them with some fascinating question that they'll go off and research and come back and tell you, here's some great plain language explanations about going to the doctor, if you're autistic or whatever the bit that you're stuck on is. Um, there's also a whole lot of websites that have information. So First Support is probably the most expansive version of that, but it isn't perfect. There's also definitely stuff missing. The disabilitysupport.gov.nz is the Disability Support Services website, and it has information about each of the contracts and the rules for using individualized funding and things like that. It's quite a dry read, but it is the point of truth, I guess, for this information. And I quite like places like Parent to Parent that have like some user-friendly guides too. And Carers New Zealand has some good ones too about different pieces of the system and how you can use it, or recommendations for how to get respite, or explaining autism to kids, all sorts of things like that. There's some really cool stuff on some of those websites. If you're a person who likes to, or finds yourself awake at 2 o'clock in the morning reading random things, it can be a really cool place to gather some information. So I'm going to do 2 seconds of flying kites and then we're going to finish and have a chat. So if you don't know us, because some of you are new to flying kites, we do a couple of things. Primarily, we help with recruitment, so disabled people who are looking for their own staff. We go off and find you the people who are right for you, the people with the skills, the personality, the values to actually match with the job that you've got. We also help people when they're stuck with goal planning and navigating the system. But what we love to do is the community resources and workshops, so conversations like this, or our big website, which is all about moving out of home and how to navigate that complicated system, with some worksheets to talk you through it. So that's us. It's really nice to be connected with you, and I'm going to stop our recording